In the aftermath of World War II, the Korean peninsula stood broken and divided. Japan's brutal occupation had finally ended, but freedom did not bring peace. Instead, Korea became trapped between two rising superpowers. The Soviet Union took control of the North, while the United States supported the South. What looked like a temporary division soon became the beginning of one of the most dangerous political experiments in modern history. Out of the chaos emerged a man who would reshape an entire nation through fear, propaganda, and absolute control: Kim Il-sung. Backed by the Soviet Union, Kim Il-sung quickly rose to power in Northern Korea. To many citizens, he was introduced as a heroic anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter who had liberated the nation from occupation. But behind the heroic image was a leader with ambitions far greater than simple political power. Kim understood something that many dictators throughout history also understood. People are easier to control when they fear you, but they become complete. As the years passed, Kim Il-sung tightened his grip over North Korea with extraordinary precision. He no longer wanted to be seen as an ordinary political leader. The regime began transforming him into something far more powerful, a living symbol of the nation itself. Through relentless propaganda, carefully controlled media, and fear-driven loyalty, Kim Il-sung slowly became the center of an entirely new belief system. In North Korea, devotion to the supreme leader was replacing religion, independent thought, and even personal identity. Across the country, enormous statues of Kim Il-sung were built in city squares and public spaces. Citizens were expected to bow before them as a sign of respect. Every home had to display his portrait, and families were ordered to keep the images perfectly clean at all times. Government inspectors could arrive unexpectedly to check whether the portraits were properly maintained. Dust or damage on the leader's image was treated almost like a political crime. Through these rituals, the regime turned loyalty into a daily performance of obedience. At the same time, North Korea's education system became one of the most powerful tools of indoctrination ever created. Children learned stories describing Kim Il-sung as a heroic genius who had almost single-handedly defeated foreign enemies. Textbooks exaggerated his achievements until they sounded almost mythical. Some stories portrayed him as possessing supernatural intelligence and wisdom. The government carefully shaped reality from the earliest stages of childhood so that questioning the leader became almost unthinkable. While Kim Il-sung strengthened his absolute control over North Korea, another plan was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Unlike most communist governments that claimed to reject monarchy and hereditary rule, Kim was preparing to pass power directly to his own son. It was a decision that shocked even some of his closest allies. North Korea was no longer evolving into a traditional socialist state. It was becoming a royal dynasty disguised as a revolution. That chosen successor was Kim Jong-il. From a young age, Kim Jong-il was surrounded by privilege, secrecy, and propaganda. State media slowly introduced him to the public as a brilliant strategist and loyal revolutionary devoted to protecting the nation. Official stories described him as exceptionally gifted from childhood, capable of extraordinary intelligence and leadership far beyond ordinary people. Just like his father before him, myths were carefully created around his image to prepare citizens for another generation of absolute rule. But Kim Jong-il possessed a different kind of obsession. He was fascinated by propaganda, cinema, and psychological control. While millions of North Koreans lived isolated from foreign culture, Kim reportedly collected thousands of international films in private. He believed movies, music, and storytelling were powerful tools capable of shaping how people think and feel. Under his influence, North Korea's propaganda machine became even more sophisticated and emotionally manipulative than before. During the early 1990s, the carefully constructed image of North Korea as a powerful socialist paradise began collapsing under the weight of reality. For decades, the regime had promised strength, prosperity, and national pride under the leadership of the Kim dynasty. Giant military parades displayed power to the world, while state propaganda insisted that the country was thriving despite foreign threats. But behind the slogans and carefully staged ceremonies, North Korea was moving toward one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the modern era. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a devastating blow to the regime. For years, North Korea had depended heavily on Soviet economic assistance, fuel shipments, and trade support. When the Soviet system disappeared, that support vanished almost overnight. Factories slowed down. Transportation networks struggled to function. Electricity shortages spread across cities and rural towns alike. The economic system that had sustained the dictatorship for decades suddenly began falling apart. Then nature made the crisis even worse. Massive floods destroyed farmland across the country, wiping out crops and damaging critical infrastructure. Food production collapsed rapidly. The government's public distribution system, which millions depended on for survival, could no longer provide enough food. Yet instead of admitting failure or reforming the system, the regime continued prioritizing military, spending, and political control while hiding the true scale of the disaster from the outside world. By the late 2000s, the future of the Kim dynasty had become uncertain. Kim Jong-il was aging rapidly, and reports about his declining health were spreading across intelligence agencies around the world. After decades of ruling North Korea through fear, propaganda, and absolute control, the regime now faced a dangerous question: who would inherit power next? In a system built entirely around one bloodline, the absence of a clear successor could trigger instability at the very top of the state. Behind the closed walls of the regime, preparations were already underway. The chosen heir was Kim Jong-il's youngest son, Kim Jong-un, a young man the world knew almost nothing about. Unlike his father and grandfather, Kim Jong-un had spent much of his early life hidden from public attention. Rumors circulated that he had studied in Switzerland under a false identity, living briefly outside the rigid world of North Korea. But inside the regime, he was being carefully prepared to continue the dynasty's rule. State propaganda suddenly shifted into action. North Korean media began describing Kim Jong-un as a brilliant military strategist and loyal protector of the nation, despite his lack of real political experience. Songs praising his leadership appeared across the country. Military officials publicly pledged loyalty to him. Government newspapers portrayed him as the natural successor destined to continue the revolutionary bloodline created by Kim Il-sung. The regime understood that the transfer of power had to appear almost sacred. Citizens were not simply expected to accept a new ruler, they were expected to worship him. Under the rule of Kim Jong-un, North Korea evolved into an even more tightly controlled and isolated state than before. While the outside world focused on missile launches and nuclear threats, an invisible system of fear continued shaping everyday life inside the country. The regime understood that military strength alone was not enough to protect the dynasty. True control required dominating how people lived, spoke, thought, and even felt. Surveillance became a permanent part of ordinary existence. Neighborhood watch units monitored families constantly. Citizens were encouraged to report suspicious behavior, unusual conversations, or signs of disloyalty to authorities. Friends watched friends. Co-workers observed one another carefully. Even inside their own homes, many families avoided discussing politics because children could accidentally repeat dangerous comments at school. In North Korea, fear was not limited to prisons or police stations. It existed inside daily human relationships. The government's propaganda system also expanded with relentless intensity. From childhood, students were taught that the Kim family protected the nation from destruction and foreign invasion. Schools focused heavily on ideology, loyalty, and revolutionary history designed around the leadership cult. Portraits of the Kim dynasty hung in every classroom, workplace, and public building. Citizens bowed before statues during national ceremonies as though participating in a state-controlled religion. As Kim Jong-un strengthened his control over North Korea, he also focused on something that would force the entire world to pay attention: nuclear weapons. For decades, the regime had pursued military programs in secret, but under Kim Jong-un, the development accelerated dramatically. Missile launches became more frequent, underground nuclear tests grew more powerful, and global tensions rose to dangerous levels. North Korea was no longer just an isolated dictatorship. It was becoming a nuclear-armed state capable of threatening international stability. For the Kim dynasty, nuclear weapons were never simply about military strength. They were about survival. The regime had carefully studied what happened to leaders like Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Both governments eventually collapsed after losing strategic deterrence against foreign powers. North Korean leadership drew a clear conclusion from those events. Countries without nuclear weapons could be invaded, pressured, or overthrown, but nuclear states were far more difficult to challenge directly. In the eyes of the Kim dynasty, atomic weapons became the ultimate guarantee that the regime would survive no matter how isolated or unpopular it became. Inside North Korea, state propaganda portrayed the nuclear program as a source of national pride. Television broadcasts celebrated missile tests with dramatic music and patriotic speeches. Scientists involved in weapons development were treated as national heroes. Citizens were told that the country was standing bravely against powerful enemies like the United States and its allies. The government framed every missile launch as proof that North Korea remained strong despite sanctions and international pressure. Outside the country, however, fear intensified rapidly.